So when we are slaves to sin, we simply do not function as we should. For us, we might find ourselves in a state where we know what the right thing is, we know what temptations to avoid, we know what sensations trigger our passions, but tied down to our senses and seeking after easy pleasures, we give in and misuse the same gifts that God gave us for freedom in slavery. St. Athanasius the Great would liken it to a mirror which is tarnished and needs polishing. What image do we reflect when we are stained with sin and the consequences of our passions? Do we really reflect the image, let alone the likeness of God in this state? How can we, when we spend our time dirtying that mirror, preventing it from functioning as it should? Christ came amongst us to help us clean that mirror, to help us reorient ourselves toward the correct path. Here we might pause and think, I thought freedom was about choice. Here we are talking about the correct path, as if there's only one. Don't I have the ability to choose? Or, more to the point, don't we live in a society which understands that we all come from different contexts and backgrounds, and we don't all follow the same path? This is true. These are real. But our society, you might reflect, still wants to be free, but free from what? Free from need, seeking comforts and money and economic security. Free to seek pleasure, maximising the senses and the experiences that make us happy. Free to speak our mind, assert our individuality, defend ourselves, criticise others, and so on. These are all characteristics of our modern society. We live in an era characterised by choice. But not just the existence of choice, the maximisation of choice. A visit to any supermarket is just the easiest example that we can see of this. But at a deeper level, if we really reflect on it, the modern world wants us to believe that almost every level of our existence is a matter of our own choosing, if we so please. We choose our careers, we choose our social status, our economic status. In the more modern world, we choose our sexuality, we choose our family, we like to think that we can choose our death. All of these things comes together with the emphasis on the individual. The mantra being, as long as I am not hurting anyone, I should be free to believe and act in whichever way I like. The beauty of the Orthodox Church, in contrast to all of this, is that it knows and it asserts that we do have our own path, but it is walked together with the Church. We are both individuals and dependent on others in our journey toward God. Similarly, we might think about the concept of obedience, or leading a life of obedience, say to a spiritual father. And even in that state, even in the state of obedience, we do not lose our freedom or our individuality. The act of obedience is itself an expression of our free will. To go back to the etymology of things, the Greek word for obedience is ipakui. The root of this word is apuo. Apuo means to hear. It doesn't mean to be compelled to do something, or to be forced to act in a way that we don't believe in, or to believe that we don't have a say in the matter. Obedience, for us, means to freely choose and accept the advice of a spiritual father. And the advice of a spiritual father is individual to us too. The advice that my spiritual father gives to me for my failings are far different to yours, for example. So as Orthodox Christians, we are faced with a paradox. The more we allow ourselves to live by God's will and not our own, the greater will be our experience of God and of our own freedom. St. Paul, in his letter again to the Romans, says, "For when you were slaves to sin, you were free in regard to righteousness." In other words, you do not know righteousness. But now, having been set free from sin and having become slaves of God, you have your fruit to holiness, and in the end, everlasting life. What's St. Paul trying to say here? He's saying that our heart will always attach itself to something. We can be slaves to sin, a state that we've discussed a little earlier, or we can try to be slaves of God, and in that way find the fruits of holiness and everlasting life. And you might say, ultimate freedom, freedom from death and everlasting life. Elder Milianos, when describing what happens when someone lets go of their own will in obedience to a spiritual father says, when I'm able to do this, when I'm able to let go of my own will, I acquire a freedom. I become free, above all from being tied down to my own will. Now I can live as an autonomous person, because I've freed myself from the greatest force there is, my own willfulness. Now there is nothing to stop my free and independent progress. I have to be ready to walk on the road that God will show me. To walk on the road that God will show me. So let us ask ourselves again, what does freedom really mean for me as an Orthodox Christian in the modern world? What does St. Paul mean when he says that Christ has made us free? Free from what? Free to be what? These are all questions that we can think about over the year. Our Orthodox faith emphasises a unique and fulfilling approach to being free in our modern age. For us, our aim is to reach a point where we aren't thrown about by our own thoughts or passions, to no longer confuse ourselves or paralyse ourselves with choices and questions and uncertainty. Rather, the free person is one who simply, humbly and quietly seeks to be close to God, tries to manage their own willfulness and passions, and in that way be free to become the person they were meant to be. As we enter 2021, may we keep this ΣΥΝΘΗΜΑ in mind to help us avoid the slavery of our passions and instead seek after Him and therefore be set free. Thank you.
It's wonderful to hear your inspiring words, and you've given us plenty to contemplate and to think about for the rest of the year. There's lots there for us to put into action. Thank you once again. At this point, I'd like to ask Mrs. Katerina Stavropoulos to say a few words. If she doesn't want to, she doesn't have to. No pressure.
Give talks and inspire the rest of us. And I hope we all had ears to hear, for there were many messages there for us to take into the year, for this new year to 2021. I think with the opportunity that we don't have a second speaker, I heard him in the last session and he was very inspiring. I want him to elaborate. I asked him to elaborate in particular the second icon that we have here, and for us to be inspired to know what we're going to be doing for this year, because it'll be a blessed year. We've been given many opportunities. I wanted to say Kronia Pola to everyone. There's a lot of work ahead of us, and with this ΣΥΝΘΗΜΑ, we will be free of what we want to do and to do the will of God. And that's the biggest freedom, to do the will of God. So, Kirpsaramati, I think, can you please take over? He's going to say it in English, so it has a different edge to it.
Just to pay more attention that she needs to go. You know that English is my second language, but still what I would say comes from the heart. I wouldn't be able to say it better in my mother language anyway. What we said earlier on, and I would like to say with maybe adding a few more things. We spoke and we heard today, twice in English and once in Greek, about the freedom that Christ has given us. Χριστός ήμας ήλευθέρωσεν, Christ has made us free. And we should congratulate Chris here, because he gave us a very good idea, an analysis of what that means. What is important, of course, is that because the Word of God is eternal, it has a meaning. It had a meaning 2,000 years ago when it was first spoken, and equally in the 21st century. it has a message, a very strong message to tell us. And it so happens that also 200 years ago, that is depicted in this ΣΥΝΘΗΜΑ, and which each one of you will have in your own desk this year, the very same depiction. As you can see, the top one indicating the classical icon of resurrection, when Christ resurrects the humankind from death or from corruption into incorruption, into the resurrection, into eternity. Adam and Eve being the first ones, representing the whole of the human race. But on the one underneath, what we celebrate this year, 200 years, the event that in 1821, as it is written with little letters there, the Greek Revolution, that after 400 years, the Greeks found the strength to free themselves, to break away from the slavery of the Ottoman Empire, and to become free. And that it was also achieved, we believe, through the charis, the blessings that came from above, through the power of our Lord. And coming to today's world, that apparently we are free to do anything we want, and as Chris very well said, we have so many choices and we choose this and that and so on. And yet, from tomorrow, we are going to have to wear a mask, as you know, as you heard in today's. If this meeting was 2 days later, we are going to have masks, you know that. Otherwise, we will be fined $200, each one of us. Be aware of that, by the way, tomorrow when you go to church, because you better have a mask with you. Maybe we have some more there for people who don't have any at home. You can get one. How free are we? I'm not going to start here any theories about conspiracies and all that. No, we are law-abiding citizens, and we should follow what the laws of the country. By the way, what we go through here now, it's all over the world. In fact, in Europe, in America, North America, is much worse. There are lockdowns. You saw probably in the media, streets were empty, whole squares, there were no people in them. This time of the year, obviously, they have to be extra careful. But coming back to what does all that mean? We have a mask that hides our face. And Christ came to free the human person. Person and face, in the Greek language, the word person indicates not just the face. I must explain this here now. It indicates the human being for who we are. We are covering that. We put in some restriction, and we are asked to control ourselves. Or generally, we know we are being maybe followed. We are being checked, checkpoints and all that. You know that. How much freedom is there, especially when it comes to wearing these masks? San Gregory the theologian says that you take the freedom from the human person and you lose the person. You lose the person. You don't have a free human being anymore if you lose the freedom of that person. And yet, we know that for 400 years, our Greek predecessors, the ancestors, were living under what the second item in that ΣΥΝΘΗΜΑ indicates. They were preserving the truth of God in the darkness. The poet would say, outside there is this depressive darkness, but inside there is the light. Of course, you can see that they're a bit constrained, they are restricted, they are isolated. All these terms very familiar to us nowadays. But in the midst, there is the light. That is the truth of God, the truth of Christ, which we don't have it just in our church, in the Orthodox Church. We can very well have it in our Orthodox homes, when we have our candili that continually is anafto, lighted, and we can have it as individuals if in our hearts that same faith for Christ sparkles, and to keep us fresh, to keep us and give us life, and especially the hope. If we are indeed this kind of Christians, then we can never be enslaved under any circumstances. Irrespective how depressive and dark and hopeless the outside world might seem, we will never be subjected to this kind of external oppression, because Christ has come to free our souls, our hearts, the human person as a whole. This is what the top depiction in your ΣΥΝΘΗΜΑ indicates. And when we have Christ in our sight, then we see something that the world that we live in today can never see. The world that we live in today, the scientists, the technologists behind all this, they can't see that other aspect in the lives of people. They cannot even perceive it. They think it's a myth. The difference with us is that we know that this world is more like a myth, and that other reality is the real world, Christ. When the Christian knows that there is God, he sees a lot further than any scientist or any person in this world that lives only for the here and now, and thus for their biological health, because that's what it is. They want to preserve us from falling sick, biologically sick. There is no any care for our soul, for our spirit. You never hear these things, and yet Christ is the Prince of our hearts, not of the body. The body is our cover. That's very much as St. Christos says very well. What we go and live in the cemeteries is our coat. That's what he says, our coat. Because our soul is gone with God in that real world. The only real world, the only reality is the eternity of God. Hence, brothers and sisters, in today's ΣΥΝΘΗΜΑ, we can see that we have a different view of the world. If we are the Christians we're supposed to be, and the ones that Christ has set them free, has made them free, we know that He's made us free. And there is not place of fear or oppression of the kind that the world around us feel. Remember, you have a different kind of view of the world. of the world. When we see with that eye of faith, we are partly here on this earth, but partly up there. That's why we can see better this world, because we can see from higher up. If we are these Christians, we have that kind of the mind of Christ in us, that can see things a lot better, much further, and much more into the reality of what is really happening. We have a different vision of the world as it is now, because I know that God sees very much as He saw the enslaved people for 400 of our Greek predecessors, ancestors, 400 years. He was looking at them, and they knew that, and that freed them at the end. If we think along these lines, we have nothing to be afraid of in today's world. Christ has indeed freed us. We have to fight for the freedom. We have to start thinking more seriously about how much I know Christ, how much Christ is part of my life, how much and sincerely I partake in the holy mysteries that give me Christ in my life, to make me that strong, to give me that kind of vision, to preserve my freedom of the spirit and of mind. And under these circumstances, there is nothing to be afraid of, because if that sparkle of faith is in my heart, nothing can enslave me. So this and other notions will be discussed during the year, especially this year, 2021, being 200 years for us Greek Orthodox, but for any kind of people living in today's world, the very, very hopeful message that Christ gives to each one of us, by in the words of St. Paul, Christ has made us free. Χρόνια πολλά σε όλους μας και να ευχηθούμε καλή κατασκήνωση σε αυτούς που θα, αν τελικά, και νομίζω από ό,τι βλέπουμε θα πάμε, αλλά με restrictions, καλή κατασκήνωση. Να υπενθυμίσω ότι to remind each one of us that next Saturday there will be at 8 o'clock the groups of men, second and Vita Kipro, 1 και 2, as well as the third Trito Kipro. They will be all here at 8 o'clock. The older men that will be here at 6:30. I think that's about all the anakinosis. Kyrio Giorgou will tell us about the practicalities now of how we're going to do it.
Before we stand up for prayer, we've already cut the Vasilopita. We had Pater Giorgou Yangas earlier in the first session, bless the Vasilopita. And so I'll ask, we'll let you know after prayer, we can sit down and we'll let you know to come to the front, to Paratena Vasilopita and to get the insignia from Kyrio Yannis and walk out this door here, please. Okay? And if